Hey Arielle, how are you? Good morning.
Good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for doing this with us. You're wrapping up Privacy Week, or at least this five-part series.
Of course, my pleasure.
Hey, so we're going to talk today, and everybody, thanks for joining us. We're here with Arielle Garcia. She's the founder of ASG Solutions. She's sharing her advice on how and why we should build responsible data practices. Arielle, you were UM's first Chief Privacy and Responsibility Officer. You pioneered their privacy practice. You've advised hundreds of people and brands on privacy, responsible media, audience strategies. You're recognized by Crane's New York Business 20 in their 20s. I could go on, right? Do you need to be more embarrassed? Or you, um, so thanks for no. Look, one of the things I've always wondered about you got like so many nice little sound bites, right? That always kind of get people thinking. So I wanted to talk about some of those and get some of your perspective on them. But the first one was, you've said before, hey, if consumers don't trust brands and advertisers can't trust their partners, sustainable growth just doesn't happen for anybody. And can you unpack that a little for us? Like, how'd you get to that spot when to think that, and what does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot behind that, right? Like fundamentally, there's the biggest challenge facing the industry is what I would deem a trust crisis, right? And part of that is that people don't trust advertising. I know I'd shared from like the FTC public comments, one comment about a young woman that was talking about how, all her life her data has been collected, and now that she's a young woman, she's using a menstrual tracking app, and that data is collected, and she knows that data is used for advertising, but like that's uncomfortable for her. She ends by saying she worries about what her life will be like as an adult. I wanted to share today another quote, and actually there were two that were salient that get at this trust problem. One of them, I'm just going to share a snippet, but it just gives you a sense for how consumers feel, which is social media companies must be limited on tracking and following users. Just because I went to find a restaurant's phone number does not mean I want to see 20 ads about restaurants in my area. Stop burying me in rubbish. And then on a more serious note, there's one that says, as a tech consumer, I'm regularly shocked and unnerved by the targeted ads that I do not want or ask for. When I had a miscarriage in 2016, due to my preparations for the baby up until the day the fetus expired, I was plagued with ads for infant supplies for months. This made it distressing for me to access the things I needed on the internet because everywhere I looked, I was reminded of my loss. Now, in that example, like there are relevant ways that there's value in delivering relevant advertising to consumers, but this is a sensitive area, right? And how would a brand know that they're causing this person actual grief, right? And so when you think about the state that we're at in the industry, we've just gotten to this point where people are creeped out, annoyed, the ad experience is disruptive, their data is tracked. On the other hand, you have not a better scenario when it comes to businesses, right? You have every couple of days another report that shows how trusting platforms to grade their own homework isn't good for brands. The incentive structures are completely broken, and so you really have this ecosystem that's just completely devoid of trust, and fundamentally that's what needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I'm with you, and it's funny. Like you have these conversations with brands about ROI and responsibility, right? And we've always seen those. We've all seen those little media indexes that say, "Hey, if you kind of rerouted money to these platforms that are a little better at, being ethical, here's what your ROI hit is." And I'm like, and you've like, thank you for this. Like, kind of wised me up to how to ask the right question here, right? Because I wanted to ask you, how do you see that tension between ROI and responsible data practices? But also, to your point, it's a better question to ask: is it okay to be flooded with obnoxious ads? Right? Like, what are your thoughts on that? This
Yeah.
ROI responsibility balance.
So it's funny because when I was early in my privacy practitioner phase, I thought that this was the thing to be overcome in this industry. The fact that there needs to be a balance between effective advertising and respecting people's privacy. And the more that I learned, the more that I realized that that is just a complete misconception. It's a false choice that props up the interests of a lot of the ecosystem. And the reality is that for the most part, what's good for consumers and what's fair for them, what's fair for brands, what's fair for publishers are more often than not aligned, right? So when you talk about that example of like, oh, there's this much ROI that's driven. Actually, I was reading the other day, Dr. Fu had a great post about like the problematic nature of last click attribution and then how view through conversions came onto the scene. And so all of that is just like, it shows how easy it is for this industry to fall in love with metrics that aren't telling the right story and its tendency towards confirmation bias. And of course, as a marketer, you're looking for ways to demonstrate ROI, to demonstrate effectiveness. But in the process, again, going back to the quotes that I shared before, people aren't winning. You're kind of operating in an illusion of effectiveness. And really, it's the platforms that stand to gain the most from this. So I think that the key to understanding or the key to asking the right question around what the balance is to understand that that fundamentally is not the right framing to begin with. And truly, if marketing and advertising is about engaging with customers and building relationships with people, then respecting their preferences, respecting their choices is fundamental, not at odds with effective marketing.
I'm with you, Arielle. And then, so then where do marketers start to, or how should they start to think about this? Starting with, let's just say, engaging with privacy teams in their own companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's one of the biggest operational challenges that I see is that marketing and privacy still just do not speak the same language. Privacy often does not understand marketing, and marketing often does not understand privacy. And so I think that it's really important to make sure that you each have a baseline understanding of one another's disciplines, right? Like that's marketing taking privacy through a 101 and an overview of what they're doing. And that's privacy taking marketing through an overview of what's changing and having a discussion, because I don't think that like most privacy people that are not living in the ad tech realm, they'll need help from their colleagues in marketing to unpack what the implications might be. So it has to be a collaborative effort for it to be effective. Now, the beauty of that is, I think, there's a misconception amongst at least some marketers where privacy or legal would be seen as a roadblock. But the reality is that without that partnership, you end up investing in things that are just on borrowed time, not solving the problem. It's funny because today our webinar is called all I know is it has something about privacy safe in the name, and that's like one of my like least favorite. I have like such a bad reaction to the term privacy safe because it means absolutely nothing, and it's become almost a blank easel for ad tech platforms to position something they're doing as solving a problem that it actually doesn't solve, right? So in order to ask those right questions, you need to work in partnership between marketing and privacy.
Yeah, good. So I was wondering where privacy safe came from, because I thought we were talking about responsible data practices. But since you mentioned it, and we're going to go deep on big tech and some of these other pieces here. But like, for example, I look at Google's privacy sandbox, and not necessarily to pick on them, but just like an example of big tech. And all right, so there's the privacy piece to it, but there's also consumers can log in and they can basically validate the data that Google has on them, right? So there's this one way to look at it is, hey, privacy and preferences is coming together. The other way to look at it is, doesn't this help you somehow, Google? Like validate the data you have, get better CPMs. And so, this idea of like privacy washing, right? And in this context, like what is it? Why should we care?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because there's two sides to the privacy washing coin. There's privacy washing with consumers, and then there's privacy washing within our industry to basically assuage the fears of marketers.
Mhm.
Both are equally problematic. I think it's funny because with Google and the privacy sandbox, it kind of backfired. Like I forget when it was. It was sometime last year that there were a bunch of reports in like just mainstream media about Google's privacy sandbox and how it's like this new tracking tool, which it's funny because it had like the complete opposite effect. And yet the pop-up that they showed to people was positioning it as a privacy tool. Like both sides are untrue, right? Like the side that said like this is even worse for your privacy, I don't know that it's worse. It's just kind of the same way it's always been, but now they can see more of it. But it also certainly, I disagree that it's fundamentally better for people's privacy. I also don't think that giving people like a little bit more visibility and a little bit more choice solves some of the more fundamental challenges that with privacy. And my overall perspective on a lot of the sandbox approaches, it seems to conflate privacy with the notion that only Google has the data, which I'm not really sure who made Google the universal steward of people's online presence.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So let's talk about that because I mean they do have a ton of data, and so so Heidi Sass, which I know you know, she sent me a report yesterday, and it talked about cynical resignation. Right. This white paper. We'll post it down here. Maybe you've seen it, but it talks about all right. So the digital advertising industry has just accepted now the increasing salience of privacy. Right. Like it's happening, and so now they're implementing privacy preserving designs or they're promising some semblance of privacy. But then the underlying business model still depends on massive flows of data. It still depends on identification. And so the idea in this paper was that, hey, this will still benefit the largest tech companies because of their access, their privileged access to first party data. So I wanted to ask your opinion on that. And then kind of secondly, I didn't read the whole paper, but it got to this point where it said, well, just don't do personalization at all. And I'm not sure I agree with that, but I mean, just on the first point, yeah, these big tech platforms do have a ton of data. There's this privacy that's getting wrapped around it, but I don't know, how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, no, I did take a look at that paper. Oh, I wish I had it in front of me because there was one part at the very beginning of it where it categorized the types of I don't know, I guess privacy washing that's kind of
Mhm.
occurring. And I thought it was super interesting. But no, I think that's exactly right, right? Like the industry and different pockets are doing different things, right? So when you take a look at all of the alternative identifiers that are emerging as part of the answer, there's kind of like this war between like Google saying like we don't think identifiers are the way, and then like there's the other side of things like the UIDs and things like that that are saying like we're building a way to do one-to-one. Both sides are a little bit disingenuous because like again Google still has the data, so I don't think anyone believes that Google's going to be like flying as blind as everyone else in the ecosystem is. I frankly don't think anyone thinks that. But on the other side, I have been asking this question about all of the ID solutions for years because to position them as inherently more privacy conscious is why, right? Like, do people have more transparency? Do they have more choice? Have we solved some of those fundamental challenges? From what I can see, no. In some cases, it's leading to more coercive experiences that will emerge for, as I've always said that with those solutions, like you have to, if it's durable, it will lose scale, because if it's durable, it will be built on a foundation of actual transparency and actual choice, which means a bunch of people may choose no. So I think that's kind of what we see happening, right? Everyone's defining privacy as whatever they can stomach or whatever benefits them.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, I love it. It reminds me of when we were in New York last year and we were at the Ethical Tech Project little event. And you had the room in uproar, right? When we were like, it was just people were like shouting. It was amazing. It was awesome because it really got to asking about the future of democracy if big tech continues to put the squeeze on publishers because they have this data, and then you put the squeeze on publishers, and what happens, right? Like journalism suffers, democracy suffers. Can you recap for us that moment? Because you had, right, there
Yeah.
was from all over the world who were just like, please keep
Yeah.
talking.
So like it was funny. So basically the panel discussion was about consumer sentiment on privacy, and we talked about their sentiment about AI. And so there was a group of people that had been in the city, I guess, for a publishers conference, and one of them asked, hey, is what we've been talking about today about privacy and like the way it impacts consumers, is that the real problem here? Or is the fact that essentially like journalism is being strangled the problem? And I said, I mean, yes, both, all of it. That's exactly, they're all, in my view, connected, right? And they're all propped up by this illusion of right person, right place, right time, right message, the precision illusion, the performance illusion that's propped up by the metrics that don't tell the real story, right? The notion of cheap reach and buying audiences that's redirecting money to made for advertising sites, and in the process starving quality publishers. And when you think about like publisher, like the game is rigged against them. The platforms have all of the data. They're never going to have as much, and yet they're still trying to play that game. And the reason why is because on the buy side, there's an expectation that they are still enabling that personalization. They are still allowing one-to-one targeting, right? And the reality is there's only one party or one group of parties that's winning in this, right? It's big tech. And frankly, whatever ad tech intermediaries thrive in the shadows that they've created. So I'm incredibly worried about what this is going to mean for democracy. I think the rise of generative AI and the acceleration of AI adoption is making this even more of a pressing challenge, and not necessarily in like the obvious ways that where like everyone's talking about the rise of deep fakes and things like that. But one of the things that I think is really problematic is you take a look at products like Google's Performance Max, and you have to some extent similar with Meta's Advantage Plus suite of products. And what it's doing is kind of conditioning marketers to relinquish more control and to also relinquish transparency in the process. And when you take that along with like self-graded homework and the affinity for metrics that look good on paper, and you get to a place where marketers are essentially being conditioned to not think about where their ads actually run. On top of that, you have generative AI and like some of the changes that Google's making to the search engine results page. They also had a patent for generative summaries. And so the trend in falling referral traffic is only going to accelerate. So publishers are going to have the squeeze get worse. They're going to have revenue pressures increase at the same time as you also have these tools that are just making it really easy and really fast to scale disinformation campaigns. And all of these sites that can easily play the game and be monetized. And that's an incredibly concerning reality. And I guess to not be a pessimist about it, the positive thing is that marketers really have the power to stop this, right? Like if they don't accept this opacity creep that we're seeing, and if they make conscious efforts to prioritize running with quality publishers and supporting quality journalism, then a lot of this can be abated. Unfortunately, that's a big behavior change, and I just don't see anything really happening, especially as like CMO tenures grow shorter and like more CMOs are being given the boot. And for some reason, the reaction to that isn't to address some of this, right? Because a lot of what we're talking about today, beyond being bad for people, like I said, is a tremendous driver of waste. It's just waste that's masked. Hopefully at some point we'll see a bigger groundswell of marketers that want to address the core of the issue.
Good. Oh, Arielle, there's so much there that I want to unpack. So let me see if I can keep these threads in my head. But firstly, publishers, right? Like in the context of New York Times versus OpenAI, right? The kind of underlying message there from OpenAI was the New York Times saying, hey, you're using our content here, right? And OpenAI is like, yeah, well, I'm just training my algorithm, man. And I'm like, is that like, how does that make it okay? I don't get it. Like, I was totally lost. Like, what, so training it's cool? Like, so you can just keep doing this stuff? And I was like, am I missing something?
Here's the funny thing, though, when you like take 2 steps back, is first it was about extraction from consumers. Mm-hmm. Now it's about extraction from publishers. Yeah. I guarantee you, if agencies keep like quietly and happily promoting Performance Max, like any second now, it'll be about extraction from agencies. And so that's just the reality of the amount of power these platforms have amassed. Yeah. The same way that, but it's funny because if you're a publisher, and granted, like the New York Times is very protective of their audience, right? But generally speaking, it's funny if you're a publisher and you're now kind of feeling the pain that's been inflicted by our collective industry on consumers all along, which is like, wait, this was my data. Like, how is it propping up your entire business model? I have no control. I have no choice. I get nothing out of this. You're telling me I get free content and services. I had that before you had all my data. All I'm getting is allegedly more relevant ads, some of which like actually cause grief for me. So it's just an interesting kind of full circle moment that demonstrates also why I've gotten to the point that I have, where it's like the dominance of the platforms just has to be addressed.
Yeah, I'm with you. I love those parallels you drew between like extraction of consumer data and publisher data. It's been happening to publishers for a while. Like think back to like Yahoo, right? Yeah. And that the Yahoo consortium. So let's talk about the obligations of marketers here. One of the things I love when you say this, but it's the dangers of personalization turning into manipulation. Like at what point, with all this data that AI will have at its fingertips, right? And maybe add to that some new technology that's already here, just pupil dilation as an example, and being able to measure like responses to certain media. What is the obligation? Like, where is that? Who's responsible for finding that line between personalization and manipulation? Is it the marketers? Is it the platform? Who cares about this? Who's going to do something about it? Yeah.
I would say anyone that has a relationship with consumers is responsible for finding that line, right? And certainly I see it as a big part of what CMOs should be thinking about, right? It's a big part of how your brand is showing up. But anyone with a direct consumer relationship that's trying to nurture those relationships should really be thinking about this. The how is going to be different for everybody. Like you said before, that I think the paper you were talking about almost suggested that we shouldn't personalize at all. I don't know that I read the same, but I could be wrong. I'll say my perspective is there's still a place for personalization where it's based on legitimate relationships and the use of data to drive personalization that nets a positive for the customer, right? Like it can't just be about frankly, I don't even know how you can. This is my whole argument, right? Like, what is growing your brand if you're pissing off your customer? It's not really, the two are not aligned. But I think that everyone's going to have to answer that question for themselves, and it's different for different verticals. I often use the example of how, like, a financial services brand is, their customers are going to expect them to have more on them and to use their data differently than a customer will of the brand that makes their batteries. And so understanding your relationship with your customer and what's appropriate when, and also that it's not all or nothing, like the concept of incremental consent, like the concept of building a relationship and not asking for everything all at once. But as it pertains to, like, I think prospecting is a place where it's just like, it's just creepy. Like, you don't need to personalize at the prospecting phase. It just doesn't make any sense.
Like, Arielle, I found myself on looking through Airbnb's privacy policy for some reason, and I was refreshed by it actually, right? Because there was a couple components. One was, hey, if you want to opt out, you can opt out, and there wasn't any, which state are you from, actually, before I ask you that. Like, it was just like, hey man, you want to opt out, and it was so easy. But then the other piece that I really liked, that's not that uncommon, was, hey, listen, we've got this project where we're looking at if landlords are biased. So can we use your name and your photo and just figure out if you can rent houses as easy as anybody else? But the way they did that, the way they talked about that bias is, hey, we're working with the Civil Liberties Union. We asked this body for their advice. And I thought that was so refreshing. So my question to you, Arielle, is, are they just weirdos here in the fact that they care about this? Are we seeing them as kind of early adopters in this idea that this is how you should be doing it? Because it's easy to put Airbnb and Patagonia in this little bucket of like, oh yeah, that's, So, and I want it to be early adopters, but I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
I don't think that anything is all one thing or all another.
Sure.
I will say that one of the challenges is conflating this idea of like impact with the idea of responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost like we do these CSR things, and so somehow that alleviates our need to address the things that are more central to our business model. That's not a good place to be. And I'm not suggesting that's what like Airbnb or Patagonia are doing, but I'd say that it's more useful to think about it as a tiered approach in order to keep it authentic, right? So first is, am I using data in ways that are responsible, fair, like have net a positive for my customer? The second is, am I aligning my business with partners that hold themselves to those same standards? Once you've done those two things, then you can go and address like the more CSR, PR worthy side of things. But if you're kind of doing one to alleviate the need to do another, that's when you get the reactions like you saw to the privacy sandbox and people seeing it as a new tracking tool.
Well, thank you for that. Let's talk about Facebook, but any platform really. One of the things you told me that really alarmed me was, I had an idea of how much data companies are collecting on us, but actually every time I think I do, I actually don't. It's far less than what is actually happening. So 2,000 companies send data about you to Facebook. And I was alarmed by that. And so many questions, right? Firstly, as a marketer, what are your obligations as you send data downstream to vendors like Facebook? I know we have contracts with them, and Facebook has contracts coming back. Is that enough? There's got to be more to it that gives choice and control for consumers. But then also this aggregate level of data that Facebook has from these 2,000 companies. What should their obligations be?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's funny because I was not shocked by that study for like a million reasons. But one of the reasons is that I've been pointing out, it was always clear to me that when Meta removed, or at the time Facebook removed partner categories, what they were doing effectively was putting it on the brand to bring their own data to the platform and just like washing their hands of the potential liability kind of. And the terms reflected that. Like, they updated their terms to make it clear that like the advertiser, reps and warrants, all of these things that no one's actually checking about the data that they're using. So of course, with how, and honestly, like they continue to push customer match as like a solution to just about everything, right? So even when they removed detailed targeting options, which was supposed to be about reducing the ability or removing the ability to target on information that's supposed to be sensitive, they promote customer match as an alternative without actually caring if the brands are going and like data elsewhere and bringing it to their platform. So it's all so all that to say, it wasn't incredibly surprising. It is interesting to think about what this means from the brand's perspective, though, right? Because if consumers understood, like the more upfront or the more they understood this relationship between brands and Meta and the type of data that they exchange, the more visibility they have, like kind of DSA style, into why they're being served an ad. I don't necessarily think that people would be fundamentally alarmed by the idea that a brand they interacted with, if that's all, if you actually look at the list, there's a lot of like agencies, data brokers, so it's not that, right? But if you think about like the brand they interacted with sharing data with a platform that they choose to interact with, and they know that they have this arrangement and what they're getting is ads from that brand, I don't think that that's fundamentally alarming, except for how many times has Facebook breached trust of consumers, of marketers, of like democracy, right? Like how many times has the platform shown its inability to prioritize impact on society over profit, right? So that to me almost becomes a case in why it's important to think about this as a business issue, because a consumer seeing that report from Consumer Reports might be alarmed. But had Meta gone about things differently, had they been more measured, had the platform been trusted, the perception might be entirely different, you know?
Yeah, totally. I've got a couple of questions for. I love that. I love your spicy takes. I feel like we could talk forever. So a couple of things. One on the platform, and then a wrap-up question we've been asking everybody. Firstly, like the Amazon Ring matter that was kind of out recently. This idea that kind of Amazon came out and said, "Hey, we're not just going to hand over data to Ring from Ring to police anymore without a warrant or subpoena," which is how things used to happen. For me, I read that as, hey, this is a step in the right direction. It's not the platform that owns the data; it's the person, and they're being a little more careful about what turns over. Is it? I mean, do you see it the same way, or is it?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was talking to Heidi the other day about this, and it seems like it could be a reaction to the FTC's in-market order. That said, it seems like a step in the right direction. I think what's more interesting is like why now? There are a lot, this topic of data being shared or sold to law enforcement and government has kind of resurfaced, and there was a bit of a lull, and it's kind of interesting that the FTC is facing it head on. There was also, I think, like a draft executive order, an executive order by Biden about basically protecting data from foreign adversaries the other day, and it spoke to some of this commercially available data. Then Senator Wyden sent a letter that the New York Times had an article about that talked about the NSA's purchase of commercially available data. So like this is in very much in the spotlight right now. I understand from like a presidential election standpoint why the foreign adversary side of it would be amplified at this time, but it's interesting because you can't bring up the one side without addressing domestic surveillance using commercially available data. So it was definitely interesting, and I think it's going to be an interesting several months. Frankly, that lead to absolutely nowhere at least before the election, but I think it'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Arielle. Hey, final question for you. We've asked everybody this over the past 5 days, but you're a chief privacy officer. You've just started at your brand or publisher, and you're working through your goals for the first 100 days. What's your advice for that person?
Buckle up. But, but no, I would say to understand what's happening. Like, ask all of the questions, especially in like this industry where you can ask the same question 15 different ways, and it seems like, and you're embarrassed to ask it more because you think that there's something you're not getting, but the reality is that it's kind of confusing by design and no one gets it. That's exactly where you should be digging in. So ask questions, understand what's happening, and not just around data flows. Understand the organization and where your biggest obstacles will be. Understand what misconceptions and what commercial interests are going to be things that you bump up against as you're trying to do your job, because you need to in order to be effective. That's how you're going to know what rooms you're going to struggle to get in and how to position yourself in a way to get the information you need to do your job.
Arielle, thanks. You're the best. I appreciate your advocacy for privacy and consumer rights here, and hopefully you keep rolling with that, which I know you will. Thanks everybody for listening. We're not done with this, right? This is just, we're kind of cracking the door open on this conversation. But we appreciate you, Arielle.
Thank you so much.
Have a good one.